Alright guys, we are going to go over the answers to our chapter 2.2 guided reading. If you are viewing this, that means you made a submission to your notes. This is just going over those answers. You can always go back and fix any questions that you missed or were confused about on your notes, and you can always resubmit them. So our first question is, the process of grouping things based on their similarities is called classification. Then our second question is, why do biologists use classification? In your reading, this was one of the sections in bold, so it just gives you that important explanation of why classification is important. But they use classification to organize living things into groups so they are easier to study. So this just allows biologists and scientists who are trying to study those organisms a way to group them together based on similar characteristics like what type of animal they are, and how they function, or different characteristics with their like size or colorings, things like that. Question 3 then, this was one of your warm-ups earlier last week, but the scientific study of how living things are classified is called taxonomy. That's just your scientific term. Classification is how we group things together based on their similarities, and then taxonomy is just the scientific term. Question 4 then is a true and false question. Once an organism is classified, a scientist knows a lot about an organism. Again, if you read through the text, this is true. Because we classify organisms based on their similarities, once they are classified, we are able to learn more about them, and we know more characteristics about them because it's easier to group them together instead of trying to pull all different types of animals and information. Your next section then is the naming system of Linnaeus. Again, if you followed along with the red headings, you should have been able to find these answers pretty easy. Question 5 is true and false. Linnaeus placed organisms into groups based on their features that he could observe. So this is true. Back in the day, observations were very important, and based on what he was able to observe and see how organisms interacted and were similar and different, allowed him to group them together. Question 6, in Linnaeus' naming system called blank, each organism is given a two-part name. So this naming system is called binomial nomenclature. Big fancy words. But he created this system to give animals and different organisms their specific scientific names. Question 7 then is the following statement true or false? A species of a group is a group of organisms that can mate with each other and produce offspring that can also mate and reproduce. For the species, that is the most specific group that organisms can be classified into, and that means that you have the same type of animal within that group, so this is true. Now question 8, I tried to go over in our directions a little bit. This was tricky for some students, but you needed to identify the genus and the species, which is the scientific names for the mountain lions, and this question already gave it to you. It's Felis concolor, so you just needed to identify it. The genus, you should have Felis, and then the species, you should have concolor. We will get more into the scientific names of animals and why they are classified these certain ways, and what their names mean as we go through the week and into next week. But for now, just start to be familiar with the two-part scientific name, understanding that it's the genus and the species to identify that specific animal. For question 9, you needed to highlight the sentences that were true about binomial nomenclature. So if you read this section, many of these statements are true. The scientific name is written in italics. Many of the scientific names are in Latin because Latin was the language of the scientists during Linnaeus's time. So that's what he was familiar with. That's what he was able to write and set the names up as. The genus name begins with a small letter is false. It actually begins with that capital letter. And then the second part of the name, which identifies the species, starts with a small letter. And then binomial nomenclature makes it easier for scientists to talk about the organism, and that is true. Now that we have some basic information about that, we get into the levels of classification. So these 8 levels of classification, there's a couple different charts within your book, but they are starting from the top level, domain, then kingdom, then phyla, or our book also said phylum if you talk about singular, class, then family, then you get into the order, and then to specifically identify an organism, you get into the genus, and the last level of classification is the species. Next question is a true or false statement. The more classification levels that 2 organisms share, the more characteristics they have in common. This is true because as you go down through the classification levels, you are identifying more similarities and more traits and characteristics that those organisms share until you get down to that specific genus group or the specific species you want to talk about. We will also look at this and compare different domains and kingdoms as well later this week. But for now, just understand as you work down through those classification levels, you identify more similar organisms. Question 12 then is looking carefully at the figure classifying an owl in your textbook. This was that picture chart of the classification levels. And this again was another tricky question, but you needed to find the order that the great horned owl belonged to. So if you look at that classification level order, there was a scientific name in Italian that you needed to identify, and that is Frigiformes. Our next section then is domains and kingdoms, and this is what different organisms and different living things are grouped into, and then they have different kingdoms and level of organization as well. So the 3 main domains are bacteria, archaea, and then eukarya. Our next question you needed to identify was how are organisms placed into these domains and kingdoms, and our text states that it's based on their cell type, so whether they're unicellular or multicellular, their ability to make food. If you remember, that would be autotroph or heterotroph. So autotroph being that they can make their own food, or heterotroph, meaning that they have to consume other organisms to obtain energy and food. And then the other way that they were placed into the domains and kingdoms was the number of cells in their body. We will get into these 3 different domains and kingdoms later on this week. So please make sure you have this filled in correctly, because this guided reading will be a good reference to notes. Question 15 then, we are highlighting information that is true about bacteria. So bacteria can be either autotrophic or heterotrophic, meaning some bacteria makes its own food and other bacteria eats something else in order to obtain energy. And then the other true statement is that bacteria are prokaryotes. We will get into that definition a little bit later. Question 16 then, a dense area in a cell that contains nucleic acids is called a nucleus. In our next section of chapter 2, we will start getting into cells a little bit more, and then at the end of chapter 2, we go through the individual parts of a cell and how they function, so we will learn about the nucleus a little bit more. Question 17 is true or false? Archaea have a similar chemical makeup to bacteria. This question is false. While archaea and bacteria do have similarities in their functions and how they obtain food, their chemical makeup is different. Question 18, you needed to give an explanation. Why are members of this domain called archaea, which comes from the Greek word for ancient? If you read our textbook section, this just explains that archaea, scientists believe that they came from the harsh conditions, and so those harsh conditions were similar to those of ancient Earth. So your answer would be something like, scientists think that the harsh conditions in which archaea live are similar to those of ancient Earth. Our last section then is talking about the domain eukarya. So our first question is the following sentence true or false? Protists can be either unicellular or multicellular. This statement is true. Protists can vary, and they can be different types, either autotrophic or heterotrophic as well. Question 20 then is, how do protists differ from bacteria and archaea? And protists are part of the eukaryote domain, which means that they have a nucleus. So their cell has that core nucleus that's able to help them function and direct specific tasks and directions for the cells to complete. Question 20 then is a true or false statement. Mushrooms, molds, mildew, and yeast are all fungi. This is a true statement. And if you read through that, it also explains how they can differ a little bit and be either autotrophic or heterotrophic, and their cell structure varies as well. Question 22 is to highlight the letter of each characteristic of fungi. All fungi are eukaryotes, meaning they have a nucleus, and they are heterotrophs, meaning they have to obtain their energy from something else. Question 23 is plants are blank, which means they can make their own food. Hopefully you are remembering these terms, heterotroph and autotroph, and plants are considered autotrophs because they are able to make their own food and obtain energy from the sun. Question 24 is a true or false question. Plants provide food for every heterotroph on Earth. You have to read this question carefully, and it could be up for debate, but our textbook says that plants provide food for most heterotrophs on Earth. So I'm going to say that this question is false. Question 25 then is to highlight the letter of each characteristic of animals. So animals are heterotrophs. They have to eat other organisms to obtain energy. And then they're also eukaryotes. So they have cells with a nucleus. Then our last question is a true or false statement. All animals are multicellular. This is true. Hopefully you checked your answers and followed along with this. If not, please make sure you do that, and if you need to, you can resubmit your 2.2 guided readings. Otherwise, we are good to go for the day. Make sure you are checking your grades and checking anything that you still need to submit. Have a good day, guys.